The Fauci hearings have revived the same partisan argument. One side says the Wuhan documents prove everything, and the other side says they prove nothing at all. Neither claim actually survives contact with the record and the facts. The documents do not prove NIH-funded research created COVID-19, but they do show that public money reached the Wuhan Institute of Virology, an experiment produced a concerning result, and EcoHealth reported it late, and NIH later struggled to obtain appropriate supporting records. Let's face it, you don't need to solve the lab leak debate in order to recognize an accountability failure. When government funds potentially high consequence research overseas, missing records and delayed reporting are not just paperwork snafus. The lack of transparency and accountability is the real issue. And here to help me sort everything out, along with some other interesting things this week, none other than my friend, co-host, current GOP candidate for vice president in 2028, Mr. Mike Termott. Mike, how are you doing today?
Good. It's good to be with you, candidate for the GOP nomination for vice president.
Yes, nomination.
Legally speaking, we have
Yes.
to continue to invoke those words. It's a joy to be with you today. The Fauci hearing before Senator Rand Paul was very interesting, even though he took the Fifth Amendment over 100 times. I don't know how many times, lots of times. It was interesting anyway, if for no other reason than the fact that he did take the Fifth. I think that we need to talk about that.
Yes.
And RFK's interview on CNN was, I think, a little bit interesting, as was the reaction. I should say, were the reactions from the left and the right, both to the hearing and to RFK Jr.'s interview on CNN, because people had profoundly different takeaways, presumably, well, apparently, due to which side of the political debate they are on. I think all of these things are worth discussing.
Right. This is one of those topics, Mike, that has so many interesting points in entry and exit points. I mean, mixed in all of this is the pardon power too that we'd mentioned. Anthony Fauci testifying before the Senate, his old nemesis Rand Paul holding the hearings, and of course, Anthony Fauci was pardoned preemptively by President Biden. And it's also interesting to see how, again, when it comes to politics, politicians and hot button issues have very short memories and long on hypocrisy, right? We're talking about pardons. We're talking about invoking the Fifth. We're talking about who knew what when. And almost paradoxically, Mike, to a lesser degree, the actual truth about COVID, or as much truth as we're going to get about COVID, is somehow not as important, I would argue, as weird as that sounds for me to say, Mike, and you could please feel free to disagree with me. But I think what we really want to look at is government power, government transparency, government accountability when it comes to matters. And I think this is the actual twist in this particular case of accountability, when the subject matter is not easily accessible to the large majority of the public. Would you agree?
I do agree. There's an old saying that a professor of mine in economics school taught me. When the clock strikes 13, right? When the clock strikes 13, you don't know what time it is. All you know is you have a broken clock. You cannot discern, well, it struck 12 last time, so it must be 1 o'clock. No, that's not how this works. Or it struck 10 3 hours ago, therefore, no. If your clock strikes 13, all you know is that you have a messed up clock. And so when you find out you can't trust your government, that doesn't mean, well, here I can trust it, there I can't. Because my corollary to that saying is, when the clock strikes 13, not only do you not know what time it is, you do not know what time it ever was. Now, looking back on yesterday when it said it was 4 o'clock, can you really believe that it was 4 o'clock yesterday? And so I agree with you that there might be more important issues than how how the virus started, right? And and by the way, we should revisit that because it is an important issue. Yeah, but to your point, there are plenty of other issues, right, going on about which the government has more information and more control than you do. And therefore, what really matters is how we hold government officials accountable and how much power we give them, both to make these decisions, to fund research and do all the other things that governments do, even though they shouldn't in most cases, in 99 out of 100 cases, they shouldn't be doing it at all, and how much power and control they have to either cover it up or disclose it. Those need to be revisited. John, regarding how the virus started, first of all, for the benefit of our viewers, let me clear something up. Everything you said is exactly right, but I want to add a piece of fact, okay? And I know this is going to make some folks' hair turn as white as mine. The virus that caused COVID-19, the pandemic, started inside the Wuhan laboratory, okay? Let me just assert that. And that is, I assert that not because I'm a virologist, I'm not. Not because I'm a medical doctor, I'm not. Just based on statistics and population and the distribution of laboratories, it would be such an incredible coincidence that the lab began research, right? What Fauci calls not gain of function, but gain of function adjacent, my phrase, not his. It's like gain of function, but it's not legally gain of function, and therefore he didn't perjure himself in front of Rand Paul 2 years ago, right? Okay, so it's what I'm going to call gain of function adjacent, what you and I would call gain of function, right? But not legally gain of function. This was something that was going on in a very small number of laboratories around the world on bat-borne viruses at any given time, like probably single digits, the number of laboratories, possibly as much as a dozen or two, right? We're not talking about all the labs that were doing research, not even all the labs that were doing viral research, not even all the labs that were doing research that year, right, on viruses, not even all those in the world that were doing research gain of function adjacent that particular year. We're talking about just those doing bat-borne viruses, not that many. Okay. So the idea that it came from Wuhan but not from the lab is, in the view of this statistician, not credible, incredible. Too much of a coincidence. I'm not buying it. It came from the lab. By the way, the CIA believes that it probably, not a high level of confidence, came from the lab. The FBI believes, not a high level of confidence, but probably came from the lab. The Department of Energy, I don't know why they're investigating this, believes, not a high level of confidence, probably came from the laboratory. So this isn't just Mike saying it, right? Lots of people don't listen to me. Ask my kids. But this time, take it from me, the virus started in the lab. Right. And the reason it's important is because we don't want it to happen again, because it killed millions of people around the world. It killed more than 1 million Americans. It was a very bad thing. And there aren't too many scientists today, I don't know of any, there probably are some, who say it was worth it, right? The research value that we're getting from gain of function viral research is worth the risk of these pandemics. Not too many people are making that argument. That's Henry Kissinger saying Vietnam was a good idea kind of thing.
Right. I did want to draw the distinction that gain of function research in and of itself is not like a malevolent tool of Dr. Evil.
That's
It's
right.
there's not like this evil professor twirling his mustache or doing the pinky thing saying, $1 trillion.
Right.
From a very scientific point of view, there is value to understanding how potentially these viruses and these bacteria do make the leap from non-human sources to humans, right?
Absolutely. And this research was going on for decades before 2019.
Right, because I don't because again, this is such a nuanced discussion, and I'm glad we're having it. I've said this before, you know this. My wife's a microbiologist. So when she hears gain of function, to her it's like, yeah, I heard someone about boiling water, or this is a procedure. It's not an evil exclusively for bioweapons or to subjugate the populace. And I think there was a lot of that sort of nonsense wrapped around that, because from a political point of view, you could always see someone taking advantage of, oh, gain of function. What is, it sounds like it would be evil, right?
Right.
But it's a methodology, it's a tool. And
It is. And there are many different types.
sure,
And if I can
sure.
offer an analogy, we're not arguing that cars and trucks ought to be banned. But gee, Dad, is it okay if I take the car because Billy and I want to race down the street in the middle of the night?
While shotgunning a couple of beers. Yes, absolutely. But that's my point, right?
Yeah.
If you were to establish, with no other context, there was gain of function research going on there, that in and of itself is not anything that I think, without additional context, that you and I could say, therefore, someone needs to go to prison.
No, no, no. I don't think anyone reasonable is making that argument. I think that,
I think some are,
well,
and I'm talking about the popular perception right now. I'm not
to
talking.
heck with them. No, the issue is whether or not the government of the United States of America was giving money to an international organization who passed on some of it to a lab in China to engage in this research, and it wasn't sufficiently controlled, in combination with perhaps not sufficiently understood, in combination with not sufficiently documented, in combination with not sufficiently disclosed, in combination with not after the fact sufficiently revealed for us to be making good policy decisions. And I think for people like you and I, John, looking in from the outside, given the black box nature of this, like you're just not going to get certain information, right?
Right, absolutely.
Okay, black box it. What goes in is our tax dollars, and what comes out is a pandemic. Worth it? No. That's where I am. That's where I am.
I would disagree with you, Mike. And of course, the process, the transparency, the accountability, with you 1,000% on 1,000%. And that's why I said, to some extent, the actual mechanics of the actual origins of the pandemic, in the sense that it was this type of virus. Is it close enough to SARS? Is it derived from SARS? Is it something else? Those are interesting questions, but I
Well,
think,
they are, and John, for people who view this differently than we do, or at least differently than I do, I don't want to throw you under the bus too quick. Um, there are those who believe it is extremely important for Americans to believe, and by the way, Fauci is one of them, who believe it is extremely important for Americans to believe that this occurred naturally and didn't come from the lab.
yes, yes.
And the reason they believe this is so important for Americans to be convinced of this, even though I'm telling you it's not true, is so that the funding continues, because they believe that the value of the research, right, is worth the risk. And I'm telling you it's not.
Well, listen, you're going to get differing opinions from people who have various stakes in it, right? Like, you cannot convince, as an analogy, you cannot convince a general that it's ever in his best interest to cut his budget. Whether there's a war going on right now, whether there's a
No, but you
credible threat.
can, you're absolutely right. But you can convince generals. As a matter of fact, a lot of generals do believe that they should not be weighing in on budget decisions. They can weigh in on what they would do with certain amounts of money. You give me $1 trillion, I do this. You give me half $1 trillion, I do that. That's what they should be weighing in on. but American generals, uh, not a lot of other generals outside the United States, but inside the United States, I would suggest that most generals do a pretty good job of saying that's a political decision. And not merely above my pay grade, but needs to be decided in a political context.
Right, and there's advocates for their position, obviously, and they have their expertise that they're asked to provide and things like that. So
The analogy is that Fauci should be saying, this is what happened. He should be telling the truth, which he's not, by the way. He's not. And he hasn't. And that's a problem for me as a former federal employee and a former cop, because he took the same oath to the Constitution that the rest of us took. He should be saying, this is what happened. Obviously, it's risky. There are risks, there are benefits. Give them a chance to articulate what the benefits are, right? And then let politicians decide.
well, let me ask you that, because I think, and again, there's so many. This conversation could go in 20 different directions simultaneously, and they would all be valid, Mike. So, since you touched on that, let's go with that for the moment, and say and let me ask you the following, right? We all remember that time, or I hope most of us of your age and my age would remember what the initial throes of this, right? When it first started breaking, when we heard the reports coming out of Italy, when we heard, hey, it's hit New York or whatever,
Yep.
we all know the immediate political spins around it. We all know what President Trump said at the time. We all know what Speaker Pelosi said at the time. The various libertarians versus conservatives versus liberals,
Yep.
political mishmash. We got it, right?
Yep.
To what extent should have expected, not in retrospect, I'm saying contemporarily, how much could we have expected Fauci and Birx and all these folks to actually be fully transparent? And again, I think I'm not excusing anybody, because we had, for example, a president who claimed that it was a fake pandemic, that it was merely the result of leftist hyperbole. We had Pelosi claiming that this president wants Americans to die. He doesn't care about people, blah, 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 blah. The typical, you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
At the same time, much like when the AIDS crisis broke, right? Fauci also had a hand in that, right? Um, we didn't know what was happening initially, right? We didn't know the true mode of transmission. We didn't know who would be affected. We didn't know what the results would be. We didn't know who the vulnerable and who was likely and not likely, at least initially, right?
Yeah.
So, to that extent, was it reasonable to expect someone like Fauci or again Birx or the president, to be able to get out there and be straight, quote unquote, with the American people when in fact nobody knew what was going on? And it's not a simple subject, Mike.
No, it's
You know,
extremely complicated.
exactly. That's what I'm trying to get at. How much simplified, how much slack do we give Fauci for performing contemporarily when this hit in 2019?
Zero. I think it's an
Probably not.
excellent question.
Yeah.
And the answer is no slack, zero, 0.00. And the reason I say that is because it wasn't his job to decide. Well, in my mind, it wasn't his job to decide what to share with politicians and what to not share with politicians. That's my problem. My problem is not that he was a bad scientist,
Okay.
right? I would much rather have a shitty but honest cop than a great but dishonest cop.
Hmm.
And I have worked with both.
Right.
Trust me, right? And I'm proud to say I was the kind of guy who a lot of people would say, gee, Mike makes his share of mistakes, but at least he tells you.
I don't disagree with you in the sense that that might be a preference. Um, and I don't know for a fact, but I'm assuming it might be a preference that most people would have in this country. But if we're holding Fauci to that standard, and I don't mean to make this a whataboutism necessarily, but do we hold other politicians to the same standard, but sort of in reverse? Meaning, speaking when they had no facts, making assertions when they had no facts. And certainly, COVID isn't the only subject this is restricted to, right? We see it now with Iran. We see it now with immigration,
In
right?
fact, that's what makes this conversation even more important, is because
Right. We see
analogously, we're talking about the whole world.
right, and that's why I initially said it almost is the actual origins and things like that are almost superfluous to the argument because it has applications across different subjects, whether it's immigration, war, the economy, criminal justice reform, health, right? And we see it now. Let's throw in yet another conversation, right? Measles are on the rise again, measles outbreaks, right? And there's a lot of now the data does show a drop, and it's worldwide, and it's pretty consistent in developed nations. That whereas you had a vaccination rate of almost universally 95%,
We're talking
which is
measles now.
measles specifically, uh, and this is the reason why this is also in the news again. And 95% is what gets you to that herd immunity level, which again, herd immunity was another phrase we heard that most people
Different,
didn't understand, right?
yes,
Different context.
understanding that you probably need to get to 95 or 96 nationally to avoid the pockets where it's going to break out being terribly significant, because 96 nationally means you're going to have pockets of 88. And that's where it breaks out. That's why it's so important. That's why people benchmark. We got to get to 94. We got to get to 95. We need to get to 96%, because that's going to leave us with not 4% evenly spread around the world, but
Right. And
98 in most places and 88 in some.
and again, this is the difficulty sometimes of being transparent about things because how many people understand the distribution curve? How many people understand theta rates and R rates and all these things, right? Nobody, you know, very few.
No, it's a very complex world. But your point is that we the government simplifies the message
Yes, that's
to
my
get us
point.
to get vaccinated.
Right. And RFK famously, vaccine critic, without commenting on whether I think he's right or wrong. He's wrong, by the way, on a lot of these things. Um, he was interviewed by Dana Bash on CNN. And to give both of them credit to some extent, neither one backed down from their position, which was good to see, right?
By the way, that's not giving Dana credit. That is a criticism.
Is it? I would give her credit
She's
over,
a journalist.
which meant she was supposed to ask questions instead of accepting things on blind faith.
Right. Her job isn't to not back down. Her job is to
Well,
ask questions, record them, and broadcast them.
fair enough. Fair enough. I give her credit because she wasn't accepting non-answers, is my point. But fair enough. That's a preference. I'm willing to say that. And I can see where you would say that's not her job. Fair enough. Um, but again, the point is that messaging to your, I think what you said is actually true on both sides of the sword, right? Which is messaging is very important. And while I can forgive people specific words, terminologies, and shortcuts, it does, people have to be held accountable for their gist, so to speak, right? So if I were to say the gist is that the current Secretary of Health and Human Services is not a fan of vaccination, right? We can play word games, Mike. He actually said this, and this has three meanings, and he meant the second of the three meanings. Right? We can play those games, and so can Fauci on the other side, right?
His gist has been anti-vax.
Has been anti-vax,
Yeah.
right? So when someone asks him, "Hey, we've seen this outbreak of measles. Vaccination rates have been going down since the pandemic. Uh, do you have any sense of responsibility on yourself for that?" I
And
think
he
it's
says no because he's never said don't get the MMR. But he has said there's no such thing as a safe and effective vaccine.
and he's also kind of been dishonest about they've never been tested. Anyway, without getting into him specifically, it's very clear that RFK is anti-vax. It was very clear where Fauci was saying certain messaging, right? In that spirit, though, public facing, you're saying he gets no slack for the simplistic messaging, whether cloth masks are actually effective or not, whether it was 6 feet, 3 feet, 10 feet that should have been the social distancing, whether right away they should have said school should be open, right? You're, am I correct in saying, in your opinion, none of that on Fauci, Birx's part should be chalked up to they were trying to simplify and give rules of thumb as opposed to specific best advice?
I think that your characterization is quite accurate. And I say, no, they shouldn't have done it. So I'm agreeing with you. I think that that's what they were doing in many cases. I don't think, especially Deborah, she doesn't impress me as a dishonest person, right? I learned the hard way as a cop for 11 years that I'm sometimes wrong in figuring out who's lying and who's not. And quite famously, in a few cases, I got tricked in both directions. But and Fauci, I think, is someone that we need to revisit because I do think that he's been dishonest in a few cases, in a few ways. But to your point, were they trying to simplify messaging in order to convey a gist, in order to more effectively get us to do things that were good for us? I think absolutely that's what they were doing. Absolutely, that's not their job. Absolutely, they got some of it wrong, thereby proving it shouldn't have been their job. And part of the problem was that they didn't have enough information to do the gist thing. In other words,
I gotcha. But when you say that, is it because they were not provided the right information, or you're just saying certain things were just unknown at that point?
a lot of things were unknown at that point that they believed were more known than they were, and they should have known better, right? And this is one of the reasons why I say it wasn't their job, because
When you say it wasn't their job, let me just
yeah.
be specific here. What are you referring to? What was not their job?
Their job was not to tell us that schools should not be reopened,
Okay.
as an example, or that businesses shouldn't be reopened. Now, Dana Bash pointed out quite in what I would characterize as quite a snippy little fashion. Well, he didn't close the businesses, the governors did. Yeah, that's right. And what do you think created the political environment in which the governors felt compelled to 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 make these decisions, as stupid as they were in some cases, probably in both directions, as stupid as they were, as uninformed as they were? Where were they getting their information? Where was the political pressure coming from? And it was because scientists were shooting their mouths off in the press. And the problem is, if an asteroid is coming and you know an asteroid is coming and you know with precision, look, the asteroid's going to hit Wednesday at 3 and it's going to hit Chicago, right? I get why you would go on the radio and say, I don't care what the governor of Illinois says. I'm telling you, Chicago's going to get hit Wednesday with an asteroid, right? That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is not having precision information and making judgments about the relative value of the information that they did have vis-a-vis things that were completely outside their wheelhouse, like people's right to conduct their business, their lives, go to school, and go about, you know, not only pursuing their life, liberty, and happiness, but all of their constitutional rights, because these were public officials that were effectively compromising your ability to go about your life because of the political environment that these scientists created, in which politicians were making these decisions. In other words, this is a version of the tail wagging the dog. Politicians are the ones whose job. Now, You and I are going to argue the politicians did a crappy job because they're idiots. Amen. I'm with you there, right? I'm with you there. There's no question about that. That's a bigger problem, and that's arguably a different podcast. But the politicians are the ones whom we pay to make these judgment calls about about whether or not they're going to close our businesses. And this is why we have a constitution to take away their power to do so. The Constitution doesn't say politicians can't shut our businesses, scientists can.
I get you. I get you. And obviously, you know, very much anti-lockdown, right? But in playing devil's advocate, and again, I'm trying to the same way I might manage my family, right? You saw again the reason I brought up the political circus around the pandemic is potentially to frame it for people like Birx and Fauci, who let's give them whatever you want to call them, they're scientists first. They're not politicians, as you said. They're not paid to make political decisions. But what if they're faced with a Speaker of the House who insists on preaching doom and gloom and, and this and that? And you have a president who thinks that, I don't know, maybe swallowing some Lysol might be a good idea. Now, as a scientist, I have to sit there and make a decision, right? I can put the science forth, doing my best to put it in relatable terms. And people look, people, someone like Lex Friedman, famous podcaster, genius AI guy, some would say on the level of an Elon Musk or something, Elon Musk himself, not exactly the greatest communicators, right? This is one of the characteristics of a brilliant scientist is they're not very good at explaining what it is they're brilliant at. And the old 10,000-hour rule applies, Mike.
Right.
If you
And
have to put 10,
politicians are very good at explaining stuff they have no idea about.
exactly. So if I'm a conscientious scientist of 100% good nature, what morally is my obligation? I'm asking you a very difficult question. What is morally my obligation if I present the facts and I am convinced, let's assume for a moment no ill will on anybody's part. I'm convinced that A needs to happen or else there will be death and destruction. I may be proven wrong later, but right now that's my true belief. And I've got people incapable of understanding what I'm trying to put across. What's my moral obligation at that point? Is it to go public? Is it to get these people in a room and lock them in a room until they understand what I'm trying to say? Do I tell little white lies? Hey, that dress looks good on you, hon. Yeah, fine, great. Right? What do I do as a moral obligation if I am a conscientious scientist in that position at that time?
You got to keep screaming. There's no question. But the people to whom you should be screaming are the politicians because they are the mouthpieces you are paid to serve.
In a political context, yes.
You are paid to,
I'm asking a very different question, which is
if the politicians just can't articulate the truth. Well, that's why I brought up the asteroid, right? If you have it, if you are so convinced with scientific precision, then you need to tell people the asteroid is coming. That's not the same thing as telling people, and therefore you need to close school on Tuesday. Because what people do with that information is not your business.
I understand what you're saying, and
The asteroid's coming on Wednesday,
the asteroid analogy, I think, fails a little bit, and I'll tell you why.
as all analogies do.
As all analogies do, yeah. Typhoid Mary, theoretically, we could argue about, hey, she's super infectious. Everyone she talks to or breathes on, will get infected. But it's not for me to just say that and then say, okay, now go on your merry way, do wherever you want. There's consequences to interact with letting her roam free, right? And or whatever the case may be, or somebody with a communicable disease being allowed to integrate without them saying, hey, at the very least, they don't have a sign around their neck that says, I am infectious. stay away from me. Now I've done my business. Now you tell me what to do, right? So that's where I think it's slightly different than the asteroid issue, right? Because the asteroid issue, it's going to hit. You want to sit there and have a cup of coffee while it hits or whatever, great.
Right.
But the infectious thing, especially when third parties are unaware they might be affected, they haven't consented to being infected, they haven't consented to the risks of being associated with someone.
That's right. And so your question is, should it be criminal for certain people to engage in certain behaviors with certain knowledge, given certain secondary effects, indirect effects, right? Externalities that affect the community. That's the question. That
No,
is,
the question is if I'm providing guidance, is it enough for me to say this person is infectious, or is it my sort of obligation to say this person is infectious, and if allowed to roam free, there will be other people who never agreed to be around that person that will get sick, and to avoid getting sick, if you see this person, wear a mask, run away from him, lock yourself in a basement or whatever. That it's the person doing the spreading knowingly, we know is a crime. We know that's a criminal thing. I'm saying, like, now I'm the public official. Is it enough for me to just say Mike's infectious, or is it Mike's infectious? If you see him, wash your hands, run away from him, don't talk to him, don't breathe at his same air. Like, you get my point, right?
I do, but I don't think that this is a gray area. I think this is settled law. And maybe it's not settled law in the infectious disease area, but there are strong enough analogies. If you know someone is committing a crime, yes, I think that you have an obligation to let the public know that there is criminal behavior going on. That's not the same thing as saying to the world, I think certain public policy decisions should be made because I'm a virologist.
Is it a semantic difference between this is how I would stop the spread of the disease and then saying do this to stop the spread of the disease? I'm not trying to be
No, it's a good question. And the answer, in my view, is that you say, under these conditions, this is our estimate of how it would spread. Under those conditions, this is our view of how the disease would spread. And these are the ramifications. And therefore you should do this is where you have gone too far. Because not only is it not your job, but you suck at it. To be frank, right? I don't know if you suck at the balancing of constitutional priorities as much as a politician would suck at virology. You probably don't suck at it that much, I hope, right? But I would say, let me flatter us. Let me flatter you and me just for a moment.
please do. So few people do, so you might as well.
I need to stand up for you and me, John.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. I think you and I would do a much better job of understanding based on statistics in virology and past research if it were explained to us by virologists and epidemiologists. You and I, having worked with a lot of statistics, right? We understand how we understand numbers and data, right? I think you and I would be better equipped to make a decision about whether or not schools should be closed than Anthony Fauci. And the reason I say that is because I think you and I have a better appreciation for the Constitution than he has demonstrated. And the marginal difference in his understanding of virology over you and me, which is enormous, is not as important as the difference between how we have come to understand individual liberty and his apparent, based on his actions, demonstrated appreciation for individual liberty. I would rather two nerds who understand data and statistics making that decision. Now, you and I are not entrusted with that because we are not elected officials, and we elect officials to make these decisions and balance these things. And sometimes we elect idiots, and sometimes we elect really smart people. Uh, I make no assertion as to my ability to discern between the two, but that's how the system not only does work, but must work. And the moment that we decide that scientists should be making these decisions, we're in big trouble, because that's what leads to the Anthony Fauci's of the world deciding what's information you should have and what is information that you don't need, because I'm going to make these decisions by the gist I'm trying to convey, which de facto gives me authority over deciding when I have enough information to do so. And if I get it wrong, oops. And the reason we're talking about measles, by the way, and I want to assert Anthony Fauci knows what I'm about to say, is that the biggest factor in putting the world on a trajectory toward the measles outbreak that we've had the past 2 years, many factors, but what launched the trajectory was, to your point, a reduction in the rates of vaccination, not due to a backlash against the COVID vaccine, but a reduction in the imposition of community rules about getting vaccinated before you go to school because kids weren't going to school. That's why the measles outbreak is bad in a lot of places that shut down. Remember that the measles outbreak is worse in Canada than the United States, is worse in Mexico than the United States, is worse in most European countries than in the United States. So this isn't RFK or a bunch of people who were, upset about vaccines. And I do believe that we should get back to RFK, because I agree with you that he messed up his gist. And by the way, I would go so far, I want to share a conversation I had with him once, in which I believe I caught a glimpse of he might even agree today that he messed up his gist. But Fauci knows and doctors know that because of the school shutdowns, a lot of bad things happened. Not just, third graders aren't good at their times tables. And
No, I agree.
decisions.
I do agree with you. I don't think it's necessarily originated with the pandemic and the school shutdowns, because we were kind of bouncing this around before we turned on the camera, and it's like, yeah, there was always the Jenny McCarthy's, who asserted the vaccines cause autism, debunked theories. There's been, and other things of that nature that started to grab hold when you had democratization of data, i.e., the internet. People could publish anything they
Sure, but
wanted.
there was a fall off the table, rapid decline in measles vaccinations in 2020.
Agreed. And I think that sort of, it
It's just
started
a
with,
weird coincidental byproduct of the school shutdowns that,
I,
that we didn't anticipate maybe at the time.
I think listen, the blowback from the dishonesty, we're paying for it now, whether it's reasonable people tolerating nonsense theories because, hey, they lied to us once, they like, there's no real evidence that, whatever, beef tallow is significantly healthier than seed oils if you eat a french fry. The problem is you're eating the french fry, right? So, I mean, but the some of that you expect with an open society, with a liberal society. People are going to be free to talk, and some of it is that we've lost the trust in so-called expertise, where nobody, and the pandemic accelerated that, and in a lot of eyes fortified that and made it even more realistic. So now no one says, like, Oh, trust me. Yeah, and Mike, I implore people sometimes who are, say, questioning vaccines or questioning certain treatments now. Whatever it is you think you're an expert in, economics, car mechanics, whatever you want, you're an expert. You feel you're an expert because you've put your 10,000 hours in. And eventually, if someone who doesn't know about your field starts asking you questions, honest questions, why does this happen? Why does this, but if they're not making progress in understanding, I challenge everyone who's listening to us. How long before you go, oh, just shut up, just trust me. I've done this. It's been proven. I don't. Why are we? We've all been. It could be, like when I used to ask my mother when I was a kid, how do you bake this cake? Well, why do you do it this way? Why do the eggs have to reach room temperature? Why does the butter have to? Why
Yep.
can't you just zap it instead of waiting for it to melt naturally? And finally, after all these questions, it's like, why is the sky blue? Oh, because of the light refraction. Well, why is the light being refracted? Why are the clouds doing that? Like the 5-year-old thing, right? How much of that, because of what happened during the pandemic, do you think we're in a worse spot now collectively? And not in terms of liberty per se, but in terms of outcomes.
Significantly worse. But I don't want to. Let me touch on the measles thing, and then we'll leave it behind.
Right. And it does pertain to the measles thing, but go ahead.
Touch on the measles thing, then we can move on, because it's my understanding that most doctors believe that the reason the vaccine rate fell off the table in 2020 was not mostly vaccine hesitation in the United States, but mostly due to kids not going to school and governments relaxing vaccine requirements. Now, whether it was more one or more the other, I don't know. But to your point, are we in a worse place now than we were before? Were we in a worse place in 1975 than 1973 because Richard Nixon turned out in 1974 to have been a crook? I would argue, as upset as I was as a 14-year-old in 1975, to finally come kicking and screaming to the realization that Richard Nixon was a crook, which was a difficult pill for a 14-year-old to swallow. Remember, in those days, we trusted everybody, right? In those days, that was difficult to swallow. I would argue we were in a better place because politicians had always been crooks. Richard Nixon got caught. Maybe he was a bigger crook or a worse crook or just worse at it. But for whatever reason, our eyes were opened more than they had been. I do not believe that the world all of a sudden in 1971 with the in 72 the burglaries of the Democratic National Headquarters. I don't believe those were the original sins and the downfall of mankind. I think that there have been sinners in power for the last, few minutes, right? And by that I mean the last 100,000 years. And so I would argue that as uncomfortable as it was, opening our eyes in 74 and 75 put us in a better place. It felt worse. It sucked. It was heartbreaking. It was wrenching, but I would argue we were in a better place. Did we lose 1 million American lives for nothing? Or did we lose over 1 million American lives to COVID-19 as a warning that you cannot trust your government? Because today, what I think most Americans, and I'm going to go with the word realize, not just believe, realize, is that the government played a hand in the development of a virus that killed those Americans and millions more around the world. through a combination of the government of the Chinese Communist Party, the leadership of the Wuhan lab, the people who probably know at the multi national agency that funneled the money, right? I'm guessing some people there know, maybe not. Maybe no one in the federal government of the United States knows, but some people know and are covering it up. And that's what I mean by the black box, and the black box matters. Because to your point, we can't, you're never going to get there in terms of enough information to control it. You've got to, at the end of the day, you got to trust someone. And we have learned that you can't. You cannot trust an American president with enough power to decide whom, when, how, and why to drop bombs on people. And I'm not talking about Iran, I'm talking about Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, and then lie to us about it. That's what we learned, right, with the Pentagon Papers. And then we learned that the clock had struck 13 and that you couldn't trust Richard Nixon about anything. It turned out he was a crook and a power-hungry jerk and would think nothing of burglarizing. He did not think that that was a big deal, by the way.
Well, he said when the president does it, it's not illegal.
And J.D. Vance recently said, with apologies to our J.D. Vance fans out there, J.D. Vance recently said that what Richard Nixon had done would be what did he say, a 3-day, 4-day story these days if it broke? First of all, that's not true. That's just a misreading of understanding the press, JD, with all due respect. But to the extent to which he
He's trivializing something serious is
heartbreaking.
And it's also revealing, if we diverge for half a second, it's revealing of his character too, as well.
I
It's
think
not
so, because I think that if you're vice president of the United States, your job is to go apoplectic,
sure. I agree.
right? And say, gee, I hope it's not a 4-day story. I hope that we haven't become numb to all the corruption in government. And this is why, to me, the black box is so important. That,
Agreed.
and this is why I say that we need a separation between science and state. Because putting this much power in the hands of so few is a recipe for disaster. No, I'm not one of these people who says, I saw the COVID coming and I predicted it, and Bill Gates is so smart and he's evil and he knew, and they conjured it all up and it's a big conspiracy. No, settle down, stop it. But is it true that when you combine, there's an old saying, when you combine science and politics, you know what you get? Politics. And that's the problem. We should not have a single federal agency in charge of funneling all this money to research. These decisions need to be made in the private sector. We need the government to stay out of it. And to the extent to which the government plays a role, my goodness, you can't have your decision makers receiving kickbacks, aka royalty payments, right? These are legal payments to Anthony Fauci, and what I understand are something like between 1,000 and 2,000 other NIH and other HHS employees, scientists, legally receiving royalties on patents for the development, manufacture, and sale of drugs that were approved by the FDA pursuant to research that was in some cases largely funded, in some cases in small ways funded by NIH grants. That's how these people got involved. I think when you look up corruption in the dictionary, there's a picture with a diagram of how NIH is funding this and the employees are getting kickbacks. That is abject corruption. And NIH says, well, we've got rules in place to, we require people to recuse themselves from certain decisions. if the system is based on NIH distributing grants, those grants leading to research and the development of patents, and the patents are shared by the people who are approving the grants, and then the FDA, a sister to the NIH, under the same HHS, right? A sister agency, then approves the drug, giving it a premier market position, a virtual monopoly in some cases, at least inside the United States, and tremendous amounts of money are made. That's corruption. That's corruption. That's how the system works. You don't have to believe that someone was bribed for a particular drug approval for it to be a corrupt system. Everyone is paid to go along. And by the way, I just learned recently, John, that these royalty payments over something like a 12-year period came to over $300 million, between 300 and $350 million. I had no idea. I thought we were talking about, a couple $1 million split up among, a couple thousand scientists. It was enough to buy yourself lunch. No, it averaged for these 1 or 2 thousand scientists. One study said it averaged $16,000 per scientist per year.
Look, corruption in government is an entire episode, right? I mean, why should scientists be cut out of the grabbing with both hands, right? Because Mike, I wasn't going to bring this up, but since you did, I feel my teeth would fly out of my mouth if I didn't mention it. Yesterday, we had the president saying, if you want to get it on insider trading, subscribe to Truth Social for 100 grand a month, because I will announce my stock
I didn't know
picks.
that he used the term insider trading, but
But that's what it is, because he said you'll
it's
get financial
abject
truth.
corruption. It is
Right. So
bare, naked corruption.
So I get you. I get you to my core. That is corruption. It should be 100% not a part of federal or any government at all. I understand that. I don't understand the vitriol specifically for scientists, though. Unless you're telling me you don't have specific extra vitriol for the scientists who do this.
No, no. It's just that that's today's episode. Next week we'll talk about another group and we'll go crazy and rail on them, right? Look, one of the things that rankles me is, well, you pointed out when it's in your field and you know something about it, it feels differently. When I come across crooked cops, it bothers me, a lot. When I see ICE misbehaving because of bad training, maybe because of bad motivation, maybe, they've got quotas. In Florida, where I was a cop, quotas were illegal. There was state statute that said quotas are illegal. And here ICE is bragging about them. And that's a culture difference, right? And I
Look,
see
the
ICE.
quotas are illegal too in New York until everyone just coincidentally gets us 30%.
Exactly 20 tickets a month, right?
Yeah, exactly. At the end of the last week of every month when tickets go up, right? So we understand how that works. So let me ask you the last one, or it's a two-part question, but I want to end on it. Um, Two things. First of all, Fauci subpoenaed, invoked the fifth, depending on which source you use, anywhere between 100 150 times he invoked the fifth. As you and I have said many times, invoking the fifth is not a confession of guilt, despite Senator Hawley's, I think, childish and inane statement that only guilty people invoke the Fifth Amendment.
No, lots of people do, and they're not all guilty.
Right, including the president, right? However, you brought up something very interesting, which is, given that Fauci was given a preemptive blanket pardon by President Biden on his way out of office, which is yet another thing, the pardon power that weaves its way into this. But in this specific case, why do you think the invocation of the fifth by Fauci so often and openly, why do you think it's a problem in this
It's a
specific case?
problem for a couple different reasons. The, what the Senate needs to do is give him immunity for his testimony.
Now, a very simplistic question, Mike. If he has a blanket pardon, why would he need
The
immunity?
blanket pardon goes backwards, not forwards. It doesn't say for all felonies yet to be committed, you're not going to go to jail. That would be cool. That would be cool. But that's not what the pardon said. So they need to say to him, you cannot be prosecuted for perjuring yourself or anything else that comes up in testimony. Now talk. This is similar to what we call in law enforcement garrity immunity, where a cop is maybe under suspicion. He's asked to, come in and tell the sarge what happened. And and the cop says, I don't think that's a good idea. You don't give up your 5A just because you're a cop, right? And the police department says, well, your job is to tell the truth. So come on in and tell Sarge what happened. And the cop says, well, you're going to have to give me immunity if you want me to shoot my mouth off. And so the police department says, all right, we'll give you what we call garrity immunity. That means we won't fire you, right? But police departments routinely fire people for not telling the truth. Either they catch you in a lie or cops just refuse to talk about what happened, either because they are afraid they did something criminal or because they're afraid it'll look like something criminal or because they're just embarrassed they did something stupid, which is 100 times more often, right? You do something stupid at work, you don't want to own up to it. How did you get the dent in your car, right? And you say, I don't know, some guy, bumped into me in the parking lot when I was, in the bathroom, and then the video shows otherwise, you're going to get fired. Okay. Cops and other government employees typically feel an obligation to tell the truth and reveal what happened because it's part of your job and it's part of the reason you signed up for the job.
Right.
My problem with Fauci is less one of criminality, although I do wonder if someday we'll find out that he went left and said a right in some testimony somewhere, but let's set that aside. My bigger problem with Fauci is one of ethics in not helping the world understand what happened.
Mm.
This is a pandemic that killed millions of people, killed 1 million Americans, and your job, first of all, your job is to help stop this shit. Okay? But again, let's set aside just being bad at your job. At the very least, do me a solid and tell me what happened so that we can try to make sure this doesn't happen again in the future. And every cop understands that. Doesn't mean every cop lives up to it. But I think that most government employees of any kind, I would go so far as to say every human, right? The vast majority of humans understand this. You know, that pizza sucked. Tell me what the recipe was so that we can make sure we don't do that again. Writ large, 1 million people died. Anthony, do me a favor. Can we please drill down and figure out what happened? Don't play games with, oh, it wasn't gain of function. You don't know what you were talking about, Senator Paul. Okay, good for you, Anthony. Good for you. Okay, good for you. You're not going to go to jail. Can we set the bar higher? Can we set the bar higher rather than just avoiding criminal perjury? Can we set the bar all the way up to, here's what he should have said. It wasn't gain of function research, but Senator Paul, let me jump in here because I see where you're going. You're worried that some of the research that we were funding led to something bad happening. I got to be honest, I don't know the answer to that. But I'm going to do everything I can to figure it out. My suggestion, and I've talked to your staff about this, Senator, is that we give immunity to everyone involved between me and China. And we try to figure this out. And if that means CIA assets, by the way, why is it that CIA believes? Why is it the CIA has allowed the world to know that it believes that the Wuhan lab created this? Because the Chinese government is not telling us. So the CIA has felt compelled to look into it themselves through covert means. We shouldn't have to, it shouldn't be the CIA weighing in on this. It should be HHS. It should be Fauci saying, let's drill down on this together. And you know what? There are going to be certain decisions that we look back on and we say, I wish I hadn't done it. I'm sorry. Um, this is research similar to what we had done for decades. We thought that there would be advantages in doing this research, and there still will be in the future, advantages doing this research. But we have learned tragically the hard way that the guardrails are very difficult to maintain. Now, is that because it was in China and not Cleveland? Maybe. I don't know. Who would have thought that putting a laboratory behind a wall of secrecy run by the communist government in China would turn out to be a transparency problem? Who would have thought? Who would have thought? So, maybe that turned out to be an issue, or maybe there's just no such thing as sufficient technology yet today to protect us from these things in a laboratory.
Or maybe that was the point
that Fauci should be pursuing with us.
Right. Or to the other side of the coin, maybe that was the point. Maybe the point was politically, you didn't want that in the US. You wanted it behind a wall in China and blame it on the communists. I mean, there's also that possibility. But to your point, why do you think it is that Senator Paul did not offer him the immunity to get at the truth? Or has this become a personal vendetta between Paul and Fauci?
I suspect, well, the short answer is I don't know, but there are all kinds of possibilities. Yeah, personal vendetta. He wanted Fauci not to take the fifth so he could prosecute him for perjury. That's a possibility. It's a possibility that he knew that he was going to take the fifth, but went ahead with the hearing anyway because all the Republican senators want to be on the record as criticizing him. By the way, speaking of weird political decisions, I don't get the Democratic senators standing up for Fauci the way that they did, just blanket.
We know why politically,
Yeah,
but I mean,
I guess I just don't think that that's. If I were their advisor, and I'm obviously not, I would have suggested a slightly more nuanced point of view. And same thing I would say to the Republicans, saying, who the F did you think you were? A little performative, not my taste. That is my sentiment. Who did you think you were? I would have backed off on looking so performative because it looks less than analytic. My recommendation, John, would be for the Senate to give him immunity, to appoint a special counsel to investigate what happened. I would put the FBI on this. I would bring CIA analysts into a closed door hearing to try to figure out what happened and what our recommendations are for control of these things going forward. These are the democratic processes that we presumably still have in place with the institutions of government when they work correctly, and they need to be allowed to work correctly without being politicized. And I don't think that Fauci is helping.
no, I don't think he's helping. Again, I don't know if he's on advice of counsel, keep your yap shut till they give you immunity, which is probably what's happening here. Maybe there's, something MAGA is very willing to talk about, which is the swamp. Maybe there's a double swerve going on where the swamp funded the research and they have Fauci as the fall guy, but he has to keep his mouth shut. So people blame him and not Trump or whatever. Like once you start entertaining these theories, it goes nuts.
Everyone has a performance that they need to get on stage.
Exactly.
I just wish that Fauci were saying publicly, in effect, what you and I have been saying, which is, let's get the team together and drill down on this, rather than nothing to see here.
Exactly. Mike, this was a interesting and spirited conversation and episode today. I'm glad we had it, but more importantly, you are running for vice president in 2028 for the Republican Party. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't know that that's more important, but we do want to make the case that national delegates should be taking matters into their own hands and selecting the next vice presidential nominee at the Republican convention in 2028. By the way, the Republican convention is being held for the first time ever in a midterm year in 2026 in Dallas in a few weeks. September 9, the Republican Liberty Caucus is hosting an event in Dallas, and we hope that folks will check it out and attend. I'll have specific information on the website soon at miketremont.com, time and place. The delegates will be collected in Dallas for 2 days, September 9 and 10. I will be there, and people even smarter and better looking will be there.
And see how that could possibly be true, Mike. But if you're
Airplanes.
willing,
Airplanes
if
will get them.
if you're certainly in Texas or going to the convention, stop by and say hi to Mike. He's a friendly guy. He's more than willing to talk to you about anything. If you want to learn more about his campaign, more about what we're trying to accomplish with Mike's campaign, please go to miketermott.com. All the information is there. That's miketermott.com. And to catch more conversations like this one on liberty in the United States, join us here on Liberty Lens. Please smash the like button, hit the subscribe. We really appreciate it. It helps us out with the algorithm. All right, until next time, for my friend and co-host, Mr. Mike Termott, this has been Big John. Peace, everyone.